Welcome to today's webinar, Just a Chat, Youth, Fear, and the Fog of Climate Change. This is episode 5 of our series on youth at the Crossroads. Climate change has become more than a scientific issue. It's an emotional one, especially for youth. At the KEI Network, we profess the importance of environmental respect, but detest the politics of climate change. We believe it's critical to listen closely to the concerns of the next generation, not to amplify their fears, but to understand the roots of their unease and help them chart a constructive path forward, and maybe for them to help us chart a path forward. As the urgency of environmental threats collides with competing crises, today's youth face not just a climate emergency, but an identity crisis about their role in solving it, if any. The challenge and opportunity is to move from confusion and fear to clarity and engagement. Today, we're exploring the evolving mindset of youth toward climate change, shaped by education, activism, media, politics, and mixed messages. So, welcome. I have a few questions that I'd like to pose to the youth advisory, and welcome Rachel, welcome Emerson, welcome Vivek, welcome Michael. I'm excited about this topic, and as I said to many, this could be one of the more controversial topics because over time, it's clear that the world seems to be bipolar on this topic. We either have global warming, now called climate change, or we don't. There seems to be no in between. What position to take, if any? Either sit back and relax because it is not an existential crisis and let others march to their heart's content, or get involved or get informed. So my first question, and I'm going to pose this to, I'll pose it to Emerson. First question about fear or focus. Do you think the way climate change has been taught, often emphasizing crisis and catastrophe, the existential crisis as it's often called, has empowered the youth generation to act or left many youth feeling overwhelmed and helpless? What's the difference?
Well, good question, and I think the answer is no. It hasn't it hasn't led people to feel empowered. When I think of people talking about the climate crisis, whether it's academics, teachers, etc., I find it's oftentimes people who are trying to push a political agenda, or even more so a cultural agenda. It's people who fundamentally do not have faith in the world, people who are lacking in hope. And so they find different things to latch onto that catastrophize, that try to make it seem that things are not going in a good direction, rather than saying, actually humans have significant potential and are able to find solutions to whatever problems arise. So yes, there might be more flooding in some parts of the world, but we can adapt to that by doing what the Dutch do, as just one example. So I don't think that's a particularly empowering way to teach people to try and catastrophize and imply that humans can't find solutions to problems. So that would be my response to that question.
Rachel, your perspective, what Emerson seems to have pointed to is that it's not truth, it's politics. It's whether your interests are being served by believing or your interests are not served. I'll make reference to that after I hear your comments. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, so I do tend to dislike the word crisis wherever it's used, and especially when it's being used over a multi-decade period of time to refer to something that ought to be acute and continues to sort of drag on in terms of solutioning. No, I don't feel that referring to something as a crisis on an ongoing basis. I think that's a really great way to drum up a lot of fatigue among people. And what I believe in is good stewardship. It's important to me that even if there were only 10 years left to the Earth, okay, this is where we live. This is the planet where we all live, and it's our responsibility to take care of it and do the best possible job of doing that. I don't think that applying the sense of crisis to that is effective. I do think, kind of to Emerson's point, I think I agree that teaching people how to take care of the things around them, starting at home, starting with even something simple like gardening, like what you do, that connects people to the earth and the environment around them, would be a much more effective way than is done right now. I do have to say, again, in terms of fatigue, though, that kind of from the time that the first predictions, Al Gore's first predictions kind of didn't come through regarding climate, it kind of introduced reasonable doubt around the idea of, the size and scale of that crisis. So yeah, I think I would agree with Emerson for the most part.
It's interesting you raised reasonable doubt because critical thinking has
Mhm.
been core to this discussion of youth at the crossroads from the very beginning, recognizing the importance of critical thinking and that it takes a little bit of education, a little bit of life to know when critical thinking needs to be engaged. Vivek, your perspective, share it with us.
Well, in my personal point of view, I would not say it's a crisis, as Rachel said. It's more of a ongoing process. And I think it is also at odds with our society's continuous need to keep expanding its energy resources, especially with things like artificial intelligence that's coming up, which requires a lot of energy. So I think that what we are trying to find out right now is a balance between how can we go into the future by increasing our energy capacity whilst reducing our ability to pollute, which would increase the climate impacts. So that is my general perspective. And I believe that it's a bit overblown. Not everybody is like taken up by fear that the world is going to end because of climate change. I do think that there is a bit of a fear, but I would not say that it is as prevalent as it was like maybe even 2 years ago. I would say that there's more optimism in the energy industry these days than there was even a couple years ago. But that is my perspective.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, because perspectives can change personally and publicly. I mean, we think personal change can flip like a coin, the public a little bit slower, usually taking some type of shock or a new insight. Marty, I know this topic is of interest to you because when we got introduced, you indicated to me your interest in the oil and gas industry, and yet clean tech now seems to be more your career focus. What's your perspective on whether or not we're being overwhelmed and feeling helpless, or whether or not we've got a perspective on something other than fear? Where do you come from?
Of course, yeah, that's a really good question. And I guess kind of my point of view of it all is, I guess it goes a little bit back to politics as well, and kind of how they're putting their agenda on, climate change and global warming. From somebody, I grew up on the land and I grew up, in the bush. And, through these past, 10, 15 years, you can even go farther back than that when, speaking to the elders in our community, how much climate change and global warming is affecting the way of our we live. And the reason why I say that is, the environment is drastically changing. Usually when it's, hunting season, duck season, there would be, over hundred of ducks, ready to hunt. But nowadays, the waters are starting to dry up because it's so dry in our landscape that, there's no ducks to hunt. Not only that, but now going to plants and medicines. Indigenous peoples use a lot of the plants and the medicines, and something we've noticed is that a lot of these medicines that used to be very abundant in our community is now nowhere to be found, or else very low abundance. And as an indigenous person, that's, kind of scary as well to us because with a lot of our ceremony and our culture, we use the whole entire environment. We use everything to run our ceremonies and our culture. And now it's, becoming harder and harder to do so because a lot of these things are disappearing with climate change. Things like the fires, the wildlife fires, there's so much of those in my area. I know this year actually my reserve experienced one of the biggest fires we've had in a long time, and we lost a lot of land. Thankfully, we didn't lose too many houses, but it's still, affecting us.
So,
And then
Michael, so you mentioned a long time and houses which weren't there 100 years ago. Are your elders able to reflect on whether or not they have experienced shifts of this nature in the past?
um I guess the best way to answer that is no. Really everything is kind of, back in the day, things did change, but it didn't change so drastically and fast to the way that things are changing now, especially with the environment and the wildlife.
Okay, okay. Thank you. We've seen the two bookends. I mean, nobody or none of those who I asked the question were in total denial, but a recognition that the environment is important. Climate change is an issue. There appears to be politics and interests that are supported or not supported by believing or not believing. So my next question is about shifting priorities. With growing concerns about mental health, and this is among youth, housing and economic insecurity, where does climate change rank among the issues that matter most to you and your peers today, and why? Vivek, I'm going to start out with you. Where does climate change rank in terms of issues like mental health, housing, economic insecurity?
Well, Perry, I would say for me, the most important issue is that of the economy and the transformation that is occurring in the economy due to things like artificial intelligence and changes in global trade. Um, and that's for me personally, that's not a reflection of the youth perspective. I know that for sure. But I would say that that is more important to me, but I also do think that the climate change factor is important in the economic transformation that we are undergoing. So I would say that that plays an element in my thought process as well. Another thing to note is that there are large financial interests pushing the changes in with regards to climate change. I know that, like, for instance, they have these things called ESG funds, which promote climate-based investing. So that plays a part in the economy as well, and that affects the way the economy functions and the goals of different companies, because you're creating an incentive for a company to go after a certain goal with certain investments due to certain, like, climate change criteria. So that's obviously going to push the economy in a certain way. It's going to create some impacts. So that also interests me as well. But I would say that it's not my top concern, but it is a concern that I do think about often because of that as well.
Okay, and you saw it interrelated to the economy quite obviously with policies like ESG and the banks getting involved in financing the greening of the economy. Rachel, what's your stand?
Um, yeah, in terms of priorities, this very much reminds me of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that I feel that, young people in particular, really, until issues closer to home and more, clear and urgent are addressed, things like the economy, things like, I think you mentioned something like buying a house, things like buying their groceries. Until those things are dealt with, they don't have the resources to deal with problems of scale like climate change. You don't have the immediacy. You have more immediate concerns and you have other things to think about. And so your brain just isn't going to stretch all the way to the problem of the city, the problems of climate change, other things like that. And so I think I tend to see that reflected a lot in youth that I'm exposed to in education. I know that I find it a lot reflected with myself. It's just that there are just other more pressing problems for them to deal with. And the other thing that I think about that is it's a double-edged sword. It's kind of the tragedy of the downfall of the economy, allowing the economy to fall to a place where you can't afford to deal with those concerns in a useful way anymore. That's a very sad thing. But I also think that it was caused by, kind of to Vivek's point, overinvestment in things like, ESGs and an artificial sort of drive towards investing in climate solutions that didn't really pan out or have any of the intended or marketed effects. And so I think that to bring those things together, a real effect, maybe to Vivek's point, something that's really technologically driven and organic inside of your community would be the best way to approach this so that you have real sustainable long-term change, whether that's starting to introduce, I'm not against electric cars for a lot of reasons. And so if you start to introduce solutions like that your market is really ready for, and that won't sort of fizzle out and just sound really good and not have a good impact on the environment itself. I think it's the combination of those two things, getting the technology right and getting the organic growth that turns that into priority that's sustainable and meaningful for your community.
Thank you. Quite insightful. Thanks, Rachel. Michael, where does climate change stand in terms of the priorities that you have?
Oh yeah, personally, I would say, climate change is my one of my number one priorities. And, from a young age, it always has been something that's been important to me, especially, growing up in the bush and in the land. And something that's, going on within my community right now is, we have over 500 oil wells just in our little reservation. And a lot of the emissions that come off of this, really affects our people, not to mention the wildlife and as well as, our medicines and our plants. So, growing up in that kind of environment, I always wondered to myself, what would I do? What am I going to do to, one day, change that perspective that everyone has right now, which is, the importance of our economy and our reservation and, bringing that money in through the oil. And for me, that was, clean energy tech and, things like introducing stuff like I think Rachel mentioned, electric vehicle. We actually installed an electric vehicle charging station in our reservation. We have two greenhouses that are currently, being ran by our Frog Lake High School, which is, going to teach the youth how to grow food and be able to, create stuff for themselves. So, not having to rely on, the big grocery systems and the farmers, but being able to do it yourself and be, reliant on the stuff that you can do. I think that the climate change, has affected a lot of people, but it's really affected indigenous people. And that's kind of why it's always been my number one priority is to come up with solutions that are, different than what has been happening in the past 20 years with the oil and gas industry.
So climate change, in your mind, equates to pollution, to emissions, and the importance of alternatives to current fossil fuel forms of energy in the interest of addressing pollution. And I'm not wanting to put words in your mouth, but this is what I'm hearing is more of a concern with what I would call pollution than climate change itself. Emerson, your
Mhm.
turn.
Great, thank you. First off, I think this is a really interesting conversation so far, very enlightening. In terms of priorities, it's not particularly high on my side. And in a line, I'd say we're in a world of geopolitics now. And in a world of geopolitics, as the focus, climate just doesn't really matter because countries need to remilitarize. And when countries go to war or prepare for war, there's going to be more emissions. So that's just the reality of the world that we are in. So then, and on the Canadian side, and to what Vivek said earlier, we need to generate wealth. And to generate wealth, we need to move projects forward. And climate concerns hinder those projects. And we really need that as a country. I think where this is a concern, or where the issue of environmental change, let's say, becomes a concern, it's with what Michael was talking about earlier. If there certain species are less prominent in certain parts of Canada and that affects Indigenous people's way of life, then that's not a good thing. And that's where the focus should be, I think, as we start to drive big projects forward on the Canadian side. So to me, that's where the concern is. It's on the Indigenous side within Canada, where probably the trade-off over time is saying that yes, the environment is going to change, even in small ways, that will affect people's longstanding cultures and traditions, and what's the right balance between cultural tradition change and economic growth, which might be good for certain populations as well over time. So that's where I'd end up on this point, is saying there's a trade-off between environmental change at local levels and economic growth, and that will be probably what Canada needs to think about going forward. But we need to move big projects forward, and those big projects are going going to potentially push temperatures a little bit higher. That's my logic on this.
Everson, I don't know if I can jump in really quickly, but to me, exactly what you're describing is why tech is such a great way to start to solve these problems. I love the intersection of difficult things and looking at hard trade-offs and saying, how can we reduce the number of trade-offs that we have to make? And tech is one of those things where I know that stuff, nuclear, for example, gets a very bad rap, but if you want to have a much more efficient energy source, if you want to contain with current modern methods, the environmental impact and the footprint, like Marty was talking about, for example, instead of having 500 wells that are spread out all across Canada, something like nuclear brings together all of those concerns. It reduces a whole bunch of impacts and it gives you a much better opportunity. And in terms of militarization, the investment would be evergreen. And you would get much more, again, like I said at the top, it's a much more efficient energy source, both for your population and for your military. And so I do think that tech is a really helpful place to look when you're starting to balance all of the priorities you're talking about, because I agree, you have to keep the top line, you have to keep the militarization, the geopolitics in mind. And if there's a way to bring all those things together, I do think tech offers solutions.
This is incredibly sobering as a discussion, even to this point. I'm not sure that a discussion of this nature could have taken place 5 years ago when the politics was clearly aligned with the existential crisis issue and what government needed to do to close down certain industries and mandate change. But we've lived with these contradictions and these mixed messages. How do you make sense of these contradictions to the extent that they still exist? In what is being taught in the schools, for example, and what's being fed through the media, and politicians continuing to echo that the need to reduce emissions or do more recycling. What do you see in terms of increased oil expansion and luxury emissions? Has this shaped your trust in the leaders or institutions? Who do you trust in topics of this nature? Let's start with, okay, Michael, let's start with you this time. Who do you trust in terms of a discussion of the economy, climate change? Who do we listen to that has public leadership roles?
Yeah, I think that's, definitely a tough question, especially with, the way politics are playing out, not just in Canada, but throughout the world. But, one thing that I've gotten from a lot of my capacity development in these past few years in more specifically clean energy, I've learned that a lot of indigenous peoples are leading the way in things like clean energy tech and are revolutionizing things like that in this area. Not to mention, we have things like our treaty chiefs who are, go from treaties 1 to 11 that are, leading these treaties as well. They have a lot of knowledge and understanding of the importance of the land and why we need to change for the better, as well as ways that, we're not going to we're not going to leave the oil and gas industry or, other pollutant jobs that are currently affecting our world overnight. But we can start to create new opportunities and new projects and start to really teach the importance of protecting our land and as well as using these clean energy tech to do that. So I would say indigenous peoples because they are on the come up, especially when it comes to clean energy tech.
Well, and I hear you echoing taking action and not just pontificating, but actually making a difference. Rachel, your perspective, who to trust on this topic?
Nobody. No, I'm kidding. I do think though, to a certain extent, I'm an engineer. I love a practical solution, and I'm trusting the most somebody who is taking a moderate position on whatever it is that they're suggesting. So in the face of the crisis that is often whipped up and tornadoed around the concept of climate, somebody who's actually any sort of politician or engineer or scientist who's kind of saying what Marty said, where, okay, this might be more of a guerrilla tactic in this case. We're not trying to push sweeping change in. We're trying to make small, sustainable, achievable changes here. That's the kind of rhetoric that I would look for to trust in. And I also kind of look at the past in cases where the present isn't serving me for, great information or, maybe some biased information. I think looking at the past, the one thing you can see for sure is that from the time of the Industrial Revolution to now, technology presses ahead in ways that benefit mankind. That's what it's for. And that can look rocky at times. If you look at mills, during the Industrial Revolution, they were terrible. They were terrible working conditions. So you look back, you can learn a lesson from that in avoiding things that are actively detrimental to people and their health. But you still want to implement gains and you want to improve mankind, improve everybody's situations, particularly people who are not well off. So to me, that's what I'm looking for in the modern landscape, is somebody who's trying to improve the environment around them, someone who's trying to improve people's lives, and someone who's doing that in a moderate and not a rhetorically inflamed way.
When Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, and this was the book that had an impact on me, and this book goes back to high school, so 60 years ago. Silent Spring was one of the first books that reflected on the importance of respecting our environment, period. I think that's still the story, and I think what climate change has driven is an increased awareness of the relevance of our environment and its importance as per the indigenous population, close living relationship with the environment. I think we've all become much more aware of the importance of our environment globally, because this is where we live. But whether or not that you need climate change and the fear of climate change in order to continue this transition, I think the economy seems to be trumping the mission. Emerson, your turn.
I would say three different groups that I trust. The first is some of the former Obama people who are very balanced when it comes to climate. When I first thought of some of the people from that team, I thought, oh, they'd be very climate catastrophizer, but they're actually not. They're very balanced. One person, Stephen Koonin, who wrote the book Unsettled, as a balanced book, as a former Obama person. Somebody who I got to know a little bit over recent years, named Jason Bordoff, who was the national security lead in the Obama administration for climate energy. And basically what Jason says is there's more people that are becoming prosperous in different parts of the world. So we need new forms of generation, whatever that is. We'll need to produce more oil, we'll need more natural gas, and we'll need more renewables. So I found the Obama people to be really good, balanced sources of insight. I'd say the second piece, building off of Rachel, engineers who have produced a huge amount of wealth for Canada. I think of people like Eric Newell and Jim Carter, formerly on the Syncrude side, even just going to the oil sands. You go there and you think, wow, it's truly incredible that people built this. To me, it's akin to seeing a person throw a baseball 90 miles per hour. As you get there and you think, I cannot believe that a human can actually do this. And that's generated a huge amount of wealth for populations, and with very good intent in terms of making many people from all different types of backgrounds wealthier. So that's the second group that I trust. It's engineers who've done great things, technologists who've done great things, but who also want to make the world better through cleaner forms of generation, whether that's oil, natural gas, or anything else. And the third piece, I would say, maybe this is where, Rachel, your earlier joke is some truth in jest, is I trust just basic critical thinking on a personal level. Just stepping back and saying, okay, there are more people that are entering the middle class in different parts of the world, Africa, Asia, etc. Those people are going to consume. That means that we are going to need to produce more stuff, and we'll need more oil for that, alongside more wind, battery, solar, etc. Hence why an above in all of the above approach is important. So there's an element of just common sense, I think, on this that's necessary, and also empathy, saying, okay, the West has done very well over recent years. Other people now want to do well in different parts of the world, so that means that there will be more production. So those are the three categories on my side.
Yeah, but almost all of them reflect on the relevance of the economy to how people live. If existential crisis was to have prevailed, people were taking the position of drop everything. The world is coming to an end.
Exactly. And just building on that, I have one friend from Montana who I met maybe 10 years ago who was very involved in student politics in Montana. And he shared this quick anecdote that I've never forgotten where the Montana Student Union was having some sort of tense debate with the governor of Montana about climate. And one day the governor just came in and he just spilt a bunch of rocks on the table and said, "This is what pays for your education." So I think there's truth to that. And people need to be realists on that point.
Vivek, can you bring us some common sense, realism, and what's your perspective?
Well, Perry, I think I resonate in a large sense with what Emerson said. But I also wanted to add the people that I don't trust on this issue are the student activists on this. And that's not to say that they're necessarily promoting bad agendas. It's just that oftentimes they seem very uninformed about what they're saying, or they don't really provide any evidence for what they're saying, or it just drums up a lot of fear. So I don't really trust anybody who does a lot of fear mongering typically. I typically like to think that there you can approach this with optimism, not even optimism, with a sense of, okay, how can we take this and turn it into an opportunity? I like that mentality. So I don't think that, oh, the world is ending is a good narrative for anybody because that just induces panic and does not create any real change or action. It just creates criticism of the establishment, which is valid in a lot of senses. But I do think that it's not necessarily it doesn't progress us anywhere forward. And I also want to recount that recently I was at a birthday party of one of my friends. And so his father is actually, he's the CEO of a clean tech company called Entropy, which I believe had a large investment from Brookfield. And he was telling me about the carbon capture industry and uh, the and the and how Alberta is actually in a very good position to take advantage of clean tech and carbon capture to promote the use of fossil fuels, actually. So Alberta is a major fossil fuel user and producer. And there is some bad optics with regards to that. But he said that that can be mitigated through the use of things like carbon capture or other such things that could actually increase the efficiency of fossil fuel usage by being able to reuse emissions in a sense, or reduce the impact of the emissions and continue making fossil fuels a viable option, considering the whole backlash against fossil fuels that was present in the economy. So that as we can see, ESG and things like that do have an impact on the economy. Companies like Entropy, for instance, largely benefit from that. And there are merits in a sense that we could make the fossil fuel industry more efficient rather than phasing it out entirely. So that's another perspective I like to think. So yeah, largely, I think that we should be talking to the people involved in business who actually change the economy structurally with regards to climate change. And we should also be talking to, as Emerson said, geopolitical experts, because we're moving into a world of geopolitics, as he said, and climate change may not be the number one priority in that world, but it still is an issue that we have to address. All right.
What I find very interesting in all of this discussion and have over the course of the last some odd years is Alberta was in the crosshairs of the activism for many years as a byproduct of having the oil sands, or the tar sands as it was referred to at that time. But Alberta was listening. Its engineers were listening. Its industry was listening. And maybe without that criticism, they wouldn't have acted as rapidly. But we heard last week, and it's being echoed in the sentiment today, that Canada and Alberta specifically have been recognized in the world as having some of the most advanced clean technology to address some of the pollution and emissions issues. So from crisis to opportunity seems to be the sentiment that it was a byproduct of the activism of 10 years ago. It did in fact bring about some changes. and they've been quite constructive on that relate to the economy as well to the environment itself. So I'm going to pick up on the next question: is activism versus agency? And I think we've touched on this, each of us. For some, activism is energizing. It's also eyeball generating. For others, it feels futile. What forms of engagement or action around climate issues actually feel meaningful to you, and which feel just performative or out of reach? I think each of you have touched somewhat on this, so we don't need to bear with it in depth. But Emerson, what do you think we have done or we could do more of in order to address some of the issues associated with climate change?
Well, I'd say just your earlier point, there's more forms of clean tech in Alberta, like carbon capture, as Vivek was saying, but there's also just cleaner oil compared to other parts of the world like China. And what I hear from oil executives in Canada, it's such a logical point, is if there's less selling of Canadian oil to global markets, people will just buy more from worse places. So that's another important argument, I think, when it comes to promoting Alberta oil. In terms of activism, I don't think it's a good word. It's better to have tough conversations in private, and most people that are activists are trying to garner personal attention. So I've never liked the word, and I probably never will. In terms of how to be involved in a meaningful way, I think it would be work in private sector companies that try to develop or that serve as responsible, clean generators in whatever sector they're in, whether that's oil, natural gas, wind, battery, solar, etc. Go and work for those companies and gain some experience in that space. I think working on the government side could be really impactful by driving forward big projects right now. That would be a really good space to be in as well. Yeah, so I mean, it's more be a part of the solution, enter sectors that are contributing to positive change on the Canadian side, rather than protesting on the sidelines. That's my short answer to it.
Okay, Michael, your point: activism versus it's just futile. It's not going to make a difference. What's your perspective?
Uh, can you maybe repeat the question there,
Sure.
Perry? Sorry, I just got back.
Activism is energizing. For some people, it's a waste of time. What action is being taken or might be taken in order to address the issues associated with climate change? You've reflected on this, of how your own population is showing an investment in alternative energies, getting involved in the energy industry now, recognizing that it provides benefits. But let's hear your perspective.
Yeah, good question, Perry. I think going back to a little bit about what Emerson said as well is, just putting yourself out there with these companies that are working on these solutions. So, solar companies, hydrogen companies, your wind companies, and, really understanding what these solutions are actually doing for our world and how they're going to be changing the landscape of things like energy and as well as production of fossil fuels within our world. I think that's one of the most important part is just really educating yourself and, whether that be working at a job that will teach you that or going back to school to learn more on these new solutions that are coming up. I know I'm starting to see a lot more new programs within, these institutes that are starting to really teach people in our world about these solutions.
So constructive action versus activism for making the point. It's not. It's more than motivating. It's doing. Vivek.
Yeah. So as I already said, I'm not particularly a fan of most activists in the climate change domain, because I feel like they don't really propose any solutions. I do actually like the business professionals in the domain, though, because they actually have solutions that go and address these issues, or in a sense, address these issues, or they're actually thinking about structural ways to change the system to address the issue. So people in government, people in the business domain, I think they're more interesting to me than activists who just keep fear mongering about the whole problem and don't really tell us what to do or exaggerate the problem more than it already is.
Okay, the metaphor that comes to mind is activism wants to create a parade. Activism wants to stimulate and motivate people to follow as a byproduct of what they portray as fearful.
I do agree with that. I do agree with that actually. But I think that it largely drums out the solution side of things and focuses more on the fear. So, like for instance, like a couple of years ago, when I would say the climate activism and I would say panic was at its peak, I would say that there weren't many solutions being proposed, or there wasn't an actual intellectual debate about what we can be doing. But there was more of this like, yeah, the oil industry is bad. Stop using it, it was mainly mitigation rather than being proactive about things. So like, okay, reduce the number of hours you turn on your light switch at home and things like that, rather than structural changes to the economy. So I would say that we are now in a better place regarding that because we've moved away from things like performative activism. Well, not entirely, but to an extent moved away. And I would say that since there's things that actually invest and create incentive for companies to go, like ESG, I'm not saying that it's entirely good or anything, but that is an example of a structural change that makes the economy go in a certain direction. So that's something that actually has an impact.
This is all sort of psychology 101. I mean, psychology will teach you that one, attention is a prerequisite to learning. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior. Therefore, you need attention or activism, some form of it anyway, marketing, if you will, in order to get people's attention. From there, education takes place, you learn, and then thirdly, you get action. So we've followed that pattern from hysteria to a more logical, a more empathetic, a more rational phase that we're in today, where money seems to matter. In discussions with the lawyer of Warren Buffett some years ago, when we were meeting with him to discuss the interests of the Hathaway in fusion energy in the future, he brought to our attention Warren Buffett's view on climate change. And Warren Buffett's view was, if the market believes in climate change, he's an investor. In other words, his interest and his perspective on it was not truth or false. It was whether it would make money or not make money. And that's where the banks landed for some time, where greenwashing was everything. We're greener than they are, therefore invest in us. And I think that's now shifted. Emerson, did you want to make an additional comment there?
Yeah, just one other point that I think is a meaningful area to work on and requires more focus going forward is how to do local community engagement effectively to help ensure that projects move forward. Because this is a big problem in Western countries, is one person in a local area can kibosh a project and throw millions of dollars down the tube. And it would be worthwhile for a person to work in a private sector company or in a local community organization, or it could be local government, to find innovative ways to get communities behind projects. One example that really resonates with me is before I moved back to Canada for a bridge year over the last year, I worked for a onshore wind company in England, one of the main American investors into wind battery solar farm in England and in Scotland. And they developed a really good approach to local community engagement where they figured out what the community cares about. And this gets back to your point, Perry, on marketing, on attention, is figure out what the local area cares about historically and then build that, like co-build that with them, rather than just putting a bunch of EVs into the local area or building a building or giving them money. So in this case, there was a community in Inverary in Scotland where there's a project being built. And years before the project came on board, the community said, we don't care about EVs. We actually care about the local pier that has been in the community for hundreds of years, but is now in disrepair. because it got bought by somebody living in Hong Kong and is now boarded up. So the company bought back the pier by working with the community, using the company's skills to raise hundreds of thousands of pounds and restore something that actually mattered to the local area. And that's now generating a lot of funds for the local area. And that's the kind of approach that will be needed more on the Canadian side, I think, going forward to see projects, to see big projects happen. So that's just another bucket, is how to do local community engagement really effectively.
Well, you've mentioned projects, several have, and I think we are entering into a phase today where we may be getting out of the doldrums that was generated by the fear of climate change into a period where we're taking constructive action in Canada, about Canada and the future of energy. We talk about Canada as an energy superpower. That would have scared the daylights out of many in the past for fear that it meant more tar sands production. Now we see, as an energy superpower, we can capitalize on all forms of energy and still retain our clean tech and our clean perspective or reputation. So finally, if you could redesign how climate change is taught or talked about in schools, media, or politics, what would you change to help move youth from fear and confusion toward informed and empowered action? What do we tell our youth today versus what we've been telling them in the past? Vivek, I'm going to start with you. What's the message for youth today?
Well, I think, Perry, the message for the youth is that they need to recognize that our economy is, as Emerson said, moving towards a geopolitical economy, and it's moving towards a large economic transformation with things like artificial intelligence. And so the demand for things like energy is going to be increasing, and that in order to meet that, we may need to put a backseat to things like climate change. However, climate change still remains an important issue, and that can be addressed through innovation rather than fear. So I think moving towards a more innovative approach, a more optimistic approach, that yes, we can innovate our way out of this crisis, or I don't want to call it a crisis, but this problem. I think that is the better mindset to equip our youth with, and that will allow them to be more entrepreneurial about these things and create solutions on that.
So take initiative in the face of a problem, take initiative rather than hiding and fearing. Emerson, I'll let you jump in here.
I think teachers should encourage students to look at facts or provide a more balanced series of facts. Just one example I was shared, and I think Perry, you got this as well. Some Our World in Data facts, a very reputable source about death rates from natural disasters, the number of deaths per 100,000 people over the last 100 years, and it's gone from in 1960, 10 deaths per 100,000 people to now about 1. And it was at 25 in 1920. So people talk about deaths from natural disasters, but actually it's declining significantly. So just introducing more facts into the debate and saying this is actually a good thing to push back against some of this fear mongering, that this is a gray area rather than black and white. That would be, I think, really helpful for students and would enable a lot of critically thinking students to feel more at ease in sharing what they actually think on this challenge. Or just saying, for example, that, okay, climate might be an issue in certain ways, like it might affect the local environment in the way that Michael's talked about, but there's other issues. There's other issues like the economy or cyber or war, and that we actually need to think about these things in terms of trade-offs. So that kind of more balanced approach would be, I think, healthy for people as well.
Okay,
and sorry, just the last piece would be the point on hope, on saying even if there is a problem here, humans innovate. We have tremendous potential as individuals, so we shouldn't be catastrophizing. We should say, actually, we can find our way through the vast majority of problems. So that would be the final piece.
excellent. Michael, you get the last word here.
All right. Yeah, I really agree with Vivek and Emerson and kind of their point of view of really, having a balance while also making sure that we're teaching the youth about the facts. And I think something that I would add on to that is also, building some of these climate solution projects near schools, or otherwise given the youth opportunity to be able to really, do things like tour them, or, make it seem like they have a part in building this project as well. Because when you're involving the youth in these projects, and, making sure that they're involved from, the planning to actually when it's starting to be built, they're going to feel really like, that's their project. They're going to feel proud of things like that and proud of climate solutions. Currently in my nation right now, I'm working on a 240 solar panel project right on top of the high school. And one of the things that we've been doing from start to now is that we've been really doing a lot of engagement with the youth. So, we started off with teaching the youth about the solar so that they can understand what's going on with the roof. And now we kind of went to the youth and we asked, well, okay, well, what are your thoughts if we had solar on the roof? And then we went to going as far as, okay, well, now we're going to do a naming contest for this project, and you guys are going to be the ones that name it. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can involve our youth into these climate solutions that'll make them proud to be a part of it, and possibly, one day inspire them to do more when they're older and, done school. So that would be kind of my final thoughts on that.
Okay, well, clearly our youth need help. That's what education is all about, and giving them exposure and opportunity for critical thinking by teaching them the relevance of facts instead of listening to celebrities. Very important for young people. Young people get drawn into the dancing, the music, the excitement of art, and not necessarily the nonfiction, but the fiction. One of you shared with me as we were getting ready for this discussion that the transition from a discussion on climate change to a discussion on pollution would be a very positive transition, to take the energy and the interests that people have and translate it into the importance of environmental respect. This doesn't mean that the climate is changing. It means that the environment's important, as the indigenous population has echoed time and time again, and as activists have stated, but maybe fearfully. It's the environment that counts, people. And facts about that environment are important, but it's when we pollute the environment, whether it be with plastics or CO2 or emissions into the atmosphere, there are limits, and it's important to understand those limits. But the importance of taking action that's constructive versus destructive, of building rather than tearing down. I think that's the message I heard today. But the underlying message that I take away is the importance of this transition from environmental hysteria to economic reality, to the importance of addressing pollution as opposed to global climate change. So I thank the Youth Advisory for all of your input today. I'm going to now open the discussion, and I'm going to call on Vivek, however, to make a point here that you made in the sidebar regarding scientism. Do you want to echo that? I think that's worthy of discussion because it relates to something that Randall's also brought up, which is science becoming politicized.
Well, I actually saw this interesting video about the concept of scientism, but I had been thinking about this earlier actually as well. I would say that many things are justified by saying trust the science, or basically just trust the science. But people don't often like actually take the time to read the science. And even if they do read the science can largely be manipulated by different funders. So like a good example of this would be like a very well-known example of this actually would be the example of how tobacco companies manipulated research on the tobacco products and like cigarettes and stuff. And I believe it was in the 60s or 50s to promote the usage of cigarettes, when in fact we now know, or well, from the new research, we know that the use of cigarettes and tobacco is not actually good for us. So I would say in a similar vein, once something has been given research and in like a published institutionalized way, like a scientific journal, for instance, uh, it has it is often drawn upon to make conclusions, but oftentimes we can't be certain about the veracity of that research because of things like financial interests. I would say that money has the great ability to manipulate the truth these days.
Well, so, and I think an important point here, Vivek, regardless of the sources of the financing or the research, is science is not one study. I mean, over and over again, you see in advertising, clinically tested. What the hell does that mean, clinically tested? As if somehow it's legitimate because we've done a clinical test. I mean, science requires enormous amounts of ongoing input from taking every angle and looking at every hypothesis in order to ever endorse that cigarette smoking was dangerous, unless you're in the asbestos industry and that tar in your lungs actually protects you from the damage of asbestos. But I'm not going to go there because I don't think that's the point. Jeff, you made an observation on the side, or Glenn, and I'll correct it. If I alluded to CO2 being a pollutant, it in itself is not a pollutant. Everything at some point becomes a pollutant when it's excessive. But CO2 in itself is not a pollutant. I'm looking for hands. Lee, this is your industry. I mean, you are involved in helping put and bring alternative energies to Alberta, whether it be net zero or looking at new forms of financing in order to help advance net zero as a means of building homes that are more, quote, energy efficient, and that is addressing the economics of life and of living. You want to add anything here, Lee, to the discussion we've had today?
Yeah, very interesting perspectives here. If CO2 is not a pollutant, I look at it as it is a pollutant because of the amount. Like you said, CO2 by itself is not a pollutant because we can use it for other things. But we've created so much of it that our parts per million in the atmosphere has gone from, well, in the last million years, it never went above 300 parts per million. Now we're at 425, and it's on a steep curve up. Nobody knows what's going to happen when it gets even more. The activists say that it's going to be a big problem, but from my point of view, we do have to use the new technologies will help with all of that. Things like geothermal heating, solar, wind. Yeah, it's just I'm not against oil and gas, but we do have to stop burning things. That's what's created our oversupply of CO2 in the atmosphere. So yeah, hysteria doesn't help, action does. Having things and ways to finance all of this is what I've been working on for the last 10 years with property assessed clean energy, with the PACE initiatives that have happened. And if that's done correctly, like they did in the US, where they've now done $16 billion and 400,000 projects of retrofits on buildings, then it'll help address the issue. But hysteria doesn't. I agree. So anyway, that's all I can add to the discussion.
I think that's a very important point, is the looking for options. If in fact you believe that something is excessive, then you take action in order to reduce it rather than running around that the sky is falling. Tom, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I just don't think we can go ahead in the future without taking into concern the environmental reactions of what we've done up to date. And that's discouraging for the young, I think. I keep thinking, I did a half-hour documentary on David Schindler, and David was a real gift to the university here. He was so powerful and proved the effects of acid rain on the environment and on phosphorus. and he was saying that, you know, you could use all the arguments in the world about phosphorus, but it was a picture they took from the air where they had a lake. Half of the lake was covered with phosphorus and the other half of the lake was not. And there was this great green plume across this lake. And it was just that little picture that brought about a complete change in the requirements for detergents and that sort of, and certainly for agricultural products. So I think, you know, that and some of the other things we can learn from some of the people that have been very active over the years in our area here certainly would make a big difference if we actually took into concern the effects of environmental problems that we have. We have out in the tailing ponds of the just a second here, lost my face. Anyway, the tailing ponds off of these things don't have to be met with hysteria, but we need to look at them and actually do something about them. And the tailing ponds amount to 1.18 trillion liters of toxic waste sitting up at the top of the South Saskatchewan River. And it's things like that we just can't ignore it. And the thousands of drilling rigs that have dotted across our environment here. These are big concerns, and there's work in all of these areas to clean them all up. So I can see people doing that in the future and doing well, hopefully, if they have the backing of the people of the country that we have.
So the underscoring of pollution again, coming back
Yeah.
to
Oh, yeah, very much.
climate change aside for the moment and talk about the transition may well be to identify areas where we have excessive pollution and what can be done, what action can be done to resolve it. So this session was very insightful. I'm absolutely delighted with the array of input that we've gotten throughout the youth series, but this session in particular was enlightening and comprehensive.